All right. I think it's good we go ahead and get started a couple minutes early. I apologize for the state of my papers. They got put in the wrong pocket of my backpack, and I didn't realize it until I was taping them up right before I had to rush home for dinner to rush back. So I'll try to get those reprinted. Tonight, I'm just going to be honest, is probably one of my weaker areas in the studies that I've done. We're going to talk about the reliability of the Gospels. It's kind of funny. Ethan was in here last week. Ethan was in my apologetics class that I taught, and we actually did this, and they did a debate on it, did a great job. But it took multiple weeks to really do a good comprehensive thing. So I'm going to try to give you guys a lot of the highlights, the good points, things to research, and then there's a really good video by a Jewish rabbi to help understand how we can research historical reliabilities of religious revelations. And then a playlist, which is where most of my information comes from, by a guy named Michael Jones. And his channel is Inspiring Philosophy. And when I first found this playlist, there were 3 videos, and he has since expanded it to like 10. Most of them are 15 to 20 minutes long, so they're easy to just take in bite-sized pieces and process and go back. So highly encourage you to look at that. Most of what I've got comes from him. But he is very, very well sourced. So, and then lastly, so for those who have voted, 2 of the big topics that we have come up as kind of big interests are the views of hell and proofs for the resurrection. So tonight is kind of the proofs for the resurrection part 1, because the reliability of the Gospels is really one of the key foundations for the reliability of the resurrection. It is where we learn of the resurrection, except for maybe a few letters from Paul. So we're going to focus on that tonight. My goal is then to do the resurrection next week, which is one of my favorites. Simply because when you rely on things from a truly historical perspective, it's a very logical thing to believe that it's true. So obviously last week we went kind of from an atheist position. The goal was to become a theist and just really truly understanding that God is real, that is the mathematical, logical, philosophical position. And then we even delved into, from logic and what we see in nature and that witness that God says he has, what God should begin to look like. And that begins to shape really what we would call the God of the Abrahamic religions, okay? So it's a God who must be eternal, he must be self-existent, he must be powerful to create everything from nothing, to defy the laws of science. And there really is only one true God that can do that. That Islam would probably claim that Allah could do it. But there are only 3 real religions that I have found that fit that bill, and that would, from their claims, and that would be Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So based from that point, we're now going to start looking at something called revelation. Now, before we do that, we're going to dive through these really quick. Appeal to authority. So you said that because an authority thinks something, it must therefore be true. This is a big one in atheism, because what do they love to do? They'll cite science. They'll cite their scientists. Well, what they don't do is let you know that there are probably pretty close to just as many Christian scientists that may disagree with them. Just because an authority says something doesn't make it true. One, you want to make sure, in order to avoid this fallacy, that it is an authority in that field, okay? It's kind of that question, are you a biologist, right? That kept coming up a few years ago. That is someone who should be able to determine what biology is. A historian would be an authority that you can reference. You can say, hey, this is their claim, this is why they made that claim, and why I think it presents good evidence, all right? It's a tricky one sometimes, but it's a good one to watch for. This one's a lot of fun, the bandwagon fallacy. So everybody knows what a bandwagon is, right? When I moved here in, let's see, I had gotten married in 2016 and was working I started in 2017 working in an event company, and the Predators had finally made it to the Stanley Cup, and there were fans everywhere. And my wife goes, and I had lived in Nashville for 4 years, and I was like, never been this many Predators fans. They were jumping on the bandwagon, right? So this is something we see and we want to watch for, and that's basically just people jumping on the trends, right? I actually had a guy try to get me to jump on a belief because, so the whole Olympic thing, first and foremost, who watched the opening ceremonies of the Olympics or knows what I'm referencing?
I know what you're referencing.
Okay. So I said I didn't think that they were intentionally doing the Last Supper. And I said, regardless of whether they were or not, I found the whole thing disgusting. I thought it was evil. But I found that a lot of Christians seemed mad, I'll put it that way, about it being a representation of the Last Supper and not about the things that were actually on the screen, right? I don't want my child to see those things, whether it's the Last Supper or not. That's the actual sin to me. And he goes, well, so you're saying that millions of Christians who are mad are wrong? And I was like, no, you're wanting me to jump on a bandwagon, to commit a bandwagon fallacy, to believe something just because the masses say it's true. Now, in the end, kind of 50-50 now. I really don't care whether they were trying to do the Last Supper or not. There are some people who would be part of the creative team that said they weren't, and there are some members of the creative team that say they were. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say who's telling the truth. It's hard to say who changed their story because they saw a cool opportunity to get publicity. In the end, I still think sin is sin, and there was sin on display, and there were things that I would not want my 2- and 6-year-old seeing. So that's what really made me mad. But those are our two this morning, or evening, sorry. Which brings us to our topic for tonight. Are the Gospels historically reliable? So when we say historically reliable, we don't just mean do we take them by faith, but how do they compare to documents that we consider trustworthy? Specifically, trustworthy from that era. Now, Mindy, you mentioned Bart Ehrman earlier. Bart Ehrman is a atheist, New Testament scholar, okay? And what he'll say is they are not reliable. And part of the reason for that is he said they don't match up to our standard of reliability. But what he means by that, and I've seen him do this in a debate, is they don't match what we as Westerners in the 21st century now believe reliability to be, okay? They are not perfect, chronological, 100% matching in every detail, okay? But if you look at what we look at for any other document that we hold to be relatively true, we don't hold it to that standard. It is only the Bible that we hold to that standard, okay? So when we say, are the Gospels historically reliable, what we are asking is, one, are the authors working within their time frame, what they need to be for biographical works, okay? Two, can we trust the details to fit within their framework of what it needs to be truth, okay? And I'm going to come back to that because that's kind of an odd statement, okay? So first and foremost, before we jump in there, we're going to talk about this. 2 types of revelation. What we've discussed so far is what we would call general revelation, okay? Things that we can look in nature. We talked about the heavens declare the glory of God. God left himself a witness through nature, and we pointed out some scriptures that reveal this so that no one is without excuse, right? So this is general revelation. But now we're going to move into special revelation, okay? Rabbi Lawrence Kellerman was a secular Jew who, for some dissertation he was doing, was studying religious revelations, more or less. So he said, in 165 major religious families and thousands of sects and cults across the planet, every religion without exception has the exact same pattern in their revelation narrative. It's basically something along the lines of a single individual is alone, has a special revelation, is converted, writes down that revelation, and begins to convert the masses, okay? Now, in the particular video that is in that link, he does what we call a straw man. We discussed this a couple weeks ago of Christianity, and this is a very common belief amongst Jews of how Christianity started. And it says something like this: the Jesus cult came about after the death of Jesus. It kind of fizzled out. A few years later, a Jewish teacher named Paul was alone on the road to Damascus, had a special revelation, and he began to preach this gospel. He wrote down all the miracles of Christ and everything that became the New Testament, or at least more than half of it. And about 300 years later, at the Council of Nicaea, they assembled all the letters and Christianity was born, all right? Now, if you know your Bible, there's a lot of problems there. But it's worth bringing up because, one, most of this statement is true. We can look at the history of Islam, we can look at the history of Buddhism, we can look at the history of Mormonism, we can look at Jehovah's Witness, we can look at several other religions and various groups, and they do come from this, right? Joseph Smith was alone, he had a special revelation, he got these golden tablets, blah, blah, blah. Muhammad was off alone, had a special dream, okay? So it seems to track. So he then follows up and says to look at the revelation narrative. If the revelation itself is not credible, then all that follows is not credible. If the revelation is credible, then what follows is credible. And of course, through this process, he began to realize that Judaism was true, at least to a point. And so he then says, okay, so let's examine Genesis in that light. He said, so God speaks to one man, Abraham. Starts off kind of like everything else. A generation later, he speaks to, again, one man, Isaac. And then a generation later, he speaks to Jacob. And it seems to follow this pattern until you get to Exodus. And in Exodus, you have these 3 million people escape Egypt. They all arrive at the foot of Mount Sinai. They all get this mass revelation from God simultaneously, and not a single person can we find that denies that revelation. And so for the first time, the first religion, you have mass revelation. Now, there are people who have tried to discredit this and say that, well, there was actually a redactor of the Torah who then went and said that this is what happened, but it didn't really happen, and there's some different holes. And he goes into a really good talk on that. And so what I would actually challenge you to do, if you get the notes, go to that link, and you can actually just, I believe, this is the title. You can search this title in YouTube and watch it, because you'll find that the prince, if you know the New Testament, what he says is actually true of, yes, the Old Testament, but it's also true of the New Testament, okay? We have a little bit of time where Jesus works with some individuals, and then we have Pentecost, and the gospel is preached, and the Holy Spirit, and it's really interesting, the historical patterns and parallels, because there are things that happen at Pentecost that we don't read happening at Mount Sinai. But if you read the Talmud, they say that several of the things that happened there happened at Sinai. And it's very interesting to see that whether it did or not happen at Sinai, God worked in a way that the Jews would understand were specifically from him. And so you do see a mass revelation, and we see the way that the New Testament was built is very similar to the way the Old Testament was built. So number one, so that's kind of how we get into the revelation narratives. And Christianity and Judaism do stand apart from every other religion in the basis of how that special revelation came about.
Does he say that about Christianity, or
he does not? Because again, so he has a straw man of Christianity, and
Gotcha.
The guy that sent me this video said, "Hey, aside from this," and he pointed out, he's like, "This is a straw man. This is not what the Bible teaches." And he goes, "Please understand," but he said everything else about this is very interesting and very true, and I found it to be so. But so he doesn't come back to that about Christianity because, as a Jew, he doesn't want Christianity to be true, right? But it was really cool for, as I was listening, like, okay, so he says this, I'm like, here's the New Testament equivalent. He says this, I'm like, New Testament equivalent. He said this, I'm like, New Testament equivalent. And it very much was what we would call a repeated pattern, right? So if you read the Bible, God works in patterns. Mm-hmm. And this was very much a new version of the old. It was really cool to see. So while it is a Jewish source, I do challenge it. It's really worth your time. And then kind of the big space we want to come to tonight. All right, so this is the channel. If you go into YouTube and just put in Inspiring Philosophy, the Reliability of the Gospels, this is a good-sized playlist. Like I said, when I first watched it, it was 3 videos. And then I went back doing the slides and everything for this, and I realized he has like 10 videos or more in that list now. So I have not watched them all. But what we're going to start with, authorship of the Gospels, okay? So there are many who will say, well, the Gospels are internally anonymous, meaning they did not sign it, they didn't put their name on it. How do we know that they actually wrote it? So this is what is assumed or have been researched by Christians. The book of Matthew was written sometime between 60 and 65 AD. A disciple of Jesus it was a first-hand account, and there are actually references to an original Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Mark was also written sometime between 60 and 63. John Mark was the nephew of Barnabas, and according to early church fathers, he is the disciple, interpreter, and scribe of Peter. So the book of Mark would be considered a second-hand account. Luke was a physician who was hired to write an account by Theophilus. He used eyewitness accounts of what he had seen to write the book of Luke, and then eyewitness accounts from the book of Acts, as well as first-hand experience in Acts. So we can see from Luke that, or in the book of Luke would be considered a second-hand account. The book of Acts would be a mixture of first and second hand accounts. And then the Gospel of John was written between 90 and 100 AD. John, also being a disciple of Jesus, would be considered a first-hand account. Now, there's some scholarship to hint that the Gospels are a building narrative. Okay, so most people hold to what's called Markan priority, that Mark came first. And so Mark being the simplest, it's a lot of people call it the action gospel, right? It's very quick, and it's kind of funny because if you know that John Mark's source was likely Peter, and you know Peter being a man of action and not a man of very many words, or the words he spoke were often a little hasty, then it kind of makes sense about Mark. And then from there you get kind of Matthew and Luke come together, but they seem to be building off of each other, and then John comes last. There are also people that hold to what's called Matthean priority, that Matthew came first. And there is actually some good early church father sources for that. We're actually going to read that account tonight. So what we want to see first and foremost, if I hit the right button.
Hey, real quick.
Yeah.
Where is the reference in Matthew that references a Hebrew source document?
It's not in Matthew. We have a reference from an early church father that Matthew wrote his first draft in Hebrew, and then it was translated to Greek rather than the Greek version that we have now.
Okay.
So, and we'll get to that. We've got, I want to say 3 or 4 different quotes from early 2nd century, I think, on that. So many ancient works. I really feel like I misspelled ancient, so I apologize. Okay, cool. For whatever reason, spell check does not work in this program. So I have to actually know what I'm doing. Many ancient works were also internally anonymous, so we should not hold a separate standard to the Gospels. Xenophon did not identify himself in the work Anabasis. Josephus left his name out of the Antiquity of the Jews, and no one questions that authorship. Many other authors, if you watch the video from Michael Jones, he lists several more. There are many authors who did not identify themselves. Elmer Herkimer, in that book, I'm not going to try, states that an author not identifying himself in his work was in fact the standard. Good example of this, okay? The book of Luke, he's writing directly to Theophilus, right? About a project that Theophilus hired him for. So he doesn't need to say, hey, Theophilus, this is Luke. Remember, you hired me to do a job. Theophilus knows exactly who he is. He knows exactly why he's writing. So he doesn't need to say, yeah, it's me. No, he's just like, hey, Theophilus, here's the work you asked me to do. He's going to know exactly who it's from, right? Julius Caesar does not identify himself as the author of the commentaries on the Civil War, and he writes entirely in the third person, as the author of John's Gospel may have done. That quote comes from Mike Licona, Are the Gospels Historically Reliable? This page is a screenshot from Michael Jones's work. Philo omitted his name from his biographical works on Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. Philo lived, I believe, in the 1st century. Plutarch makes no mention of his name in his parallel lives. Porphyry does not state he is the author of any of his surviving works. Philostratus does not mention his name in his biographic work. Nepos does not mention his name in his biographic work. Tacitus, who is a historian of that time, leaves his name out of his biography of his own father-in-law. Lucian doesn't mention he is the author of his works, Alexander the False Prophet, the Toxaris, and the biography of Demonax. So what we see here is it's incredibly common for authors of this era, even when writing biographical works, to not sign them. So for us to say, well, this was a work of such importance, they should have signed it, is actually kind of a logical fallacy. We want them to match up with things of the time. So this is going to switch gears here to what we can actually see historically of an actual debate of who wrote an unauthored work. The book of Hebrews is not authored. And in Papyrus 46, it's implied that Paul was the author. Tertullian, another church father, attributes the book of Hebrews to Barnabas. Eusebius is quoted saying that Origen said that Paul was the author. Other attributions are Clement of Rome and Luke, and I have actually heard theorized Aquila and Apollos. In the book, The Alleged Anonymity of the Canonical Gospels, Simon Gathercole says, this sort of diversity is exactly what we did not find in references to the authorship of the Gospels. So we see a great debate about who wrote Hebrews. We do not see any, and I do not mean like, well, there could have been 1 or 2. I mean 0 debate about who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. starting at the bottom of this list, you actually get the earliest to latest going here. So the late 1st century, John the Elder mentions Mark. Papias in around the year 100 or early 2nd century mentions Matthew, Mark, and John by name. The Gospel of Thomas, which was believed to be written between 140 and 180, mentions Matthew by name. Ptolemy in 150 to 175 mentions John by name, and you can kind of read up through there. And as early as 174-ish, somewhere in there within a decade, Irenaeus, another church father, in his work against heresies, actually mentions by name all 4 Gospels. Okay? This is not debated in this time. They weren't passing these letters around and saying, hey, I think Matthew wrote this one. It could have been, well, maybe it was Matthew, maybe it was Bartholomew, No, they knew exactly who wrote these despite their anonymity. Some quotes from these church fathers. So Papias lived from 70 AD to 163. He was a disciple of John, according to church history. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately everything that he remembered, without, however, recording in order what was said or done by Christ. For neither did he hear the Lord, nor did he follow him, but afterwards, as I said, attended Peter, who adapted his instructions to the needs of his hearers, but had no design of giving a connected account of the Lord's oracles. So then Mark made no mistake while he thus wrote down some things as he remembered them, for he made it his one care not to omit anything that he heard, or to set down any false statements therein. So here we see that the book of Mark is a pieced together narrative of Peter's teachings. It's not meant to be taken chronologically, but it is meant to be true and accurate. And it is attributed to John Mark directly. Irenaeus, who lived from 130 to 202, was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome. This should be circa 60 to 63, I believe, and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, which I think puts us close to 65, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had leaned upon his breast, which is mentioned in the book of John, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia.
Quick question.
Yeah.
The Hebrews piece again. Do we have record of a Hebrews copy? I feel like all the things I've heard about Matthew is that we have Greek.
All we have are the Greek manuscripts.
Yeah.
This is kind of the only hint that he may have actually composed the gospel in Hebrew.
So I kind of wonder, if we have so many copies of the Greek, why don't we have any of the Hebrews?
So this is going to get a little speculation.
Okay, that's fine. That's kind of where I'm at.
In church history, Hebrews was not quite a dead language, but it was only spoken by the Jews. Okay? Greek was the trade language of the Roman Empire. They actually tried to keep Latin mostly for the military, okay? Since they took over the Greek Empire, a lot of nations already kind of had elements of Greek in their language and knew basics of it, so they made that the common language and then kept their own military language. So Greek was the goal for Gentile conversions, right, or converts. That's what they understood. That would be most internationally known. Matthew seems to have written his gospel specifically to be a witness to the Jews. However, as we know, the Jews did not take lightly to Christ. They didn't warm up to that idea very well. So that gospel was quickly translated into Greek, and it's likely that it just wasn't kept up in Hebrew because as the church became more Gentile and less Jewish, they favored a lot of the Greek more. So again, it's speculation, but there's a little bit within the church history that would kind of lead us to some cause for that. Good question. This is a very long quote, and it actually takes up 3 slides. So, again, another quote from Irenaeus. He said, I love this because it's just so cool. It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout all the world, and the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars, breathing out immortality on every side, and vivifying men afresh. From which fact it is evident that the Word, the artificer of all, he that sitteth upon the cherubim and contains all things, he who is manifested to men has given us the gospel under 4 aspects, but bound together by one Spirit. As also David says, when entreating his manifestation, thou that sittest between the cherubim, shine forth. For the cherubim too were 4-faced, and their faces were images of the dispensation of the Son of God. For, as the scripture says, the first living creature was like a lion, symbolizing his effectual work, his leadership and royal power. The second living creature was like a calf, signifying his sacrificial and, I apologize.
Sacerdotal.
Thank you. But the third had, as it were, the face of a man, an evident description of his advent as a human being. The fourth was like a flying eagle, pointing out the gift of the Spirit, hovering with his wings over the church. And therefore the Gospels are in accord with these things, among which Christ Jesus is seated. For that according to John relates his original, effectual, and glorious generation from the Father, thus declaring, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Also, all things were made by him, and without him was nothing made. For this reason, too, is that gospel full of all confidence, for such is his person. But that according to Luke, taking up his priestly character, commenced with Zacharias the priest, offering sacrifice to God. For now was made ready the fatted calf, about to be immolated for the finding again of the younger son. Matthew again relates his generation as a man, saying the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And also, the birth of Christ was on this wise. This then is the gospel of his humanity, for which reason it is too that the character of a humble and meek man is kept up through the whole gospel. Mark, on the other hand, commences with a reference to the prophetical spirit coming down from on high to men, saying, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is written in Isaiah the prophet, pointing to the winged aspect of the gospel, and on this account he made a compendious and cursory narrative, for such is the prophetical character and the word of God himself, used to converse with the ante-Mosaic patriarchs in accord, and that's ante, not anti, so like with Moses, in accordance with his divinity and glory. But for those under the law, he instituted a sacerdotal and liturgical service. Afterwards, being made man for us, he sent the gift of the celestial spirit over all the earth, protecting us with his wings. Such then, as was the course followed by the Son of God, as was also the form of the living creatures, and such as was the form of the living creatures, so was also the character of the gospel. For the living creatures are quadriform, and the gospel is quadriform, as is also the course followed by the Lord. For this reason were 4 principal covenants given to the human race. One prior to the deluge under Adam, the second that after the deluge under Noah, the third the giving of the law under Moses, the fourth which renovates man and sums up all things in itself by means of the gospel, raising and bearing men upon its wings into heavenly kingdom. I think that's really, really cool.
Where'd that come from again?
That is Irenaeus.
Oh, who was
So Irenaeus was a
disciple of
disciple of Polycarp, and it's believed Polycarp was a disciple of John the Beloved. So this comes from the 2nd century. So we're talking, I want to say it said, hang on, I can backtrack. He lived from 130 to 202.
So he's pretty soon.
And John the Beloved, we know, wrote John and Revelation sometime between 90 and 100. John was believed to be the youngest disciple, very likely a teenager at the time of his calling to follow Jesus. Which does kind of explain some of the closeness, right? So we have Peter and James being the older brother of John, were very close, but then John being this tender kid was very much shaped by Jesus and very closely molded, which you would want to do if you had a teenager traveling with you anyway, because that can be a lot of fun. So, really cool, right? Another thing though, the authors, if this were not the true authors, who was picked is very, very unlikely. Matthew was written as a witness to Jews, but Matthew was a tax collector. This was someone hated by Jews. Why would you pick the most anti-Jew disciple to be the witness to the Jews, right? That doesn't make sense. Mark and Luke weren't actually followers of Jesus. They were disciples of disciples. You could have picked any one of the disciples and said, oh, this is the gospel of Thomas, or this is the gospel of Levi. Like Luke, as being the priestly book, why not pick the guy that's named after the priest? Pick Levi, although Levi and Matthew were the same person, so that wouldn't really work. I see the hole in that one. John is, of course, is kind of the least problematic because John is attributed to a disciple who was very close to Jesus. So to have three of the four authors be very unlikely candidates to be gospel writers kind of says this might actually be accurate because it doesn't make sense unless it's true. Next, we can see direct comparisons to their openings to other biographical works of the time frame, all right? Matthew opens his book with a genealogy. Plutarch and Nepos both do this in several of their works. Mark jumps right in with that one sentence, right? That this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Xenophon does that in his works, and in the work, The Life of Timoleon. I don't remember who wrote that, but it starts off very much the same way. Luke's has this big opening preface, right? He's addressing the person who told him to write this letter, who hired him. He's addressing Theophilus. Lucian does that, and Philo does that in several of his works. They give this kind of opening preface. And then John, with his very extended monologue, is very similar to the work of Socrates, and Lucian does this as well. So it's very interesting that these people took the time to write all this down, and they do it in ways that match other Greco-Roman biographies, okay? To me, that says they're reliable. It means that they are what they claim to be. They are biographies of the works of Jesus. Now, there's a few other things we're going to get into, which I don't think I have a lot of slides for, so I'm going to go ahead and throw this up here. This is, again, the playlist where a lot of this information comes from. Michael Jones follows up the first couple videos with a kind of a breakaway into the study of the mind, okay? Because one person has actually said, not one, one of the most common complaints is, well, why didn't they write this down sooner? Why is it so far removed? Jesus died in 30-ish AD, and the first gospel was written at the earliest around 60 AD, after most of the works of Paul. Well, first and foremost, so they say, well, your memory fades over time, okay? So what scientists have actually figured is that what we call high impact, low frequency events stick the clearest in your mind, okay? I don't know how many of you have actually seen a blind man receive his sight. I mean, I see that like at least 3 times a week, so this is not a big deal, right? I see people walk on water all the time. I go to the hospital and regularly see people get up from the dead. Like, it's not a big deal. That's absurd. And these people were these writers, first and second hand accounts, were seeing this over and over. In fact, John says that the world could not contain the scrolls if everything Jesus said and did in those 3 years was written down. He did a lot. And so these are the ones that stuck out with them the most. Okay? I'm going to give you an example here from my life. It's very embarrassing. Ethan will get a kick out of it. This is Ethan's little sister. I'm really happy that she's in the class. It's a lot of fun. And yeah, you're Ethan's little sister as well. So my junior year of high school, I was playing basketball. I know I'm short. Okay, it was a small school, small team, didn't have tryouts. I made the team. We happened to make it. Our school was part of about 16 Christian schools in the Northwest of America. And we hosted every year around President's Day a 3-day tournament. Now, it had been years since we as the home school made the Final Four in basketball. It just didn't happen. All right. My junior year, we tied for 4th and 5th place. We had to actually add an extra game. So we played on Monday, we played on Tuesday. Tuesday night, they had like a banquet, which was our version of prom, but we weren't allowed to have prom. And they announced, hey, we have a tie for 4th place. So you guys are going to go back to the gym and play tonight to see who makes it into the Final Four. We played the best game we have ever played. I mean, we dominated. It was awesome. However, the team that we were scheduled to play the next morning went home and went to sleep. And we had never beat them. I mean, from the time I was in 5th grade and started in junior high, I have never beat this team. The year I went into varsity, my little brother's team beat them in JV, and I was really mad. They go home and sleep while we are just playing our hearts out. We get up the next day and we're exhausted. They're fresh. They're killing us. Well, throughout the course of the season, my coach had a little bit of an anger problem. He had bent several clipboards, things like that. Not over anybody's head, nothing violent, but and he had gotten a couple reprimands from referees. So about halfway through the season, he decides, no more. We're going to straighten this up. Well, the reffing was not all that great, in my opinion, that day. We were already losing. And our center, I'm standing at the back of the court, and I can see clear as day. The rules in basketball are if you're straight up, it's not a foul, right? He is straight up on a kid bigger than him. Like, our center was 6'2", this other kid was 6'4", and this kid goes up into him, they call a blocking foul. And I'm standing by the bench, right? So they're on the other end. I'm standing like just past half court. I'm standing there and I look at my dad who's right behind the team. I was like, he was clean. That's all I said, right? Go back in the game. They shoot their shots. They shoot the first shot. Ref blows the whistle. Coach says, Jeremy. So I come off the bench or come down. Think, okay, it's a sub, whatever. I sit down. He looks at me and says, if you want to talk about the refs, do it from here. He didn't put me back in the rest of the game and we lost. Now, I'm not the reason we lost. I was not the best player on the team. But the reason that sticks with me is my senior year, I didn't go back to that school. I went homeschooled and went on the road. That's the last moment I had on a basketball court with that team. It was a very high intensity, low frequency event, and I remember it like it was yesterday. Now, this has been 20 years or more. Let's see. That was 2009. So, not quite 20 years. I'm not that old yet. But if I can remember that, right? There was nothing special about that, nothing miraculous, nothing life-altering about that, but it's there. Imagine seeing somebody pull thousands of fish after you couldn't pull a single one. Imagine seeing the dead get up and walk. Imagine seeing Lazarus come out of the tomb. Imagine seeing water turned into wine. Like actual water, and now it is literally purple. There was no food coloring, okay? Imagine seeing a withered, shriveled hand that looked like a raisin turn healthy. A lame man whose legs were bent and muscles were atrophying become whole, and he gets up and walks. You're not going to forget that. It doesn't matter how low frequency it is. Like, that's really high impact. And the words that man said, I'm telling you what, if somebody walked up to me and healed just my scoliosis, I'm probably going to listen to every word that man says. All right? Let alone if he raises my sister from the dead. No, I don't have a dead sister, but a loved one from the dead, if he heals a blind. Like, if I'm seeing these miracles, I am going to be listening intently. And let me tell you something. He didn't just preach a sermon and then preach a different sermon and then preach a different sermon. He likely preached these things and taught his disciples over and over and over and made sure that they were living it over the course of their time as a teacher. So them being able to write this down 30 years later, not that big a deal. It's really not, especially when you consider that any other source we have for any other historical figure is so far more removed. So, if I were to put this on a timeline, Jesus died, so Jesus' ministry is roughly from 27 to 30 AD, right? Gospels are written, the Synoptic Gospels are written between 60 and 65 AD. Okay, that's roughly 30 to 35 years. Alexander the Great, I want to say his biographies that we have were written over 175 years after he was on Earth. And they're not questioned. Now, don't quote me on that number. I know it's like something like that. The biographies we have of Julius Caesar, over 100 years. We have better, more reliable information on the biographies of Jesus than we do that William Shakespeare was a real person. Okay? So for historians to say, well, we can trust that Alexander the Great was real, that all of the Caesars were real because of these works, that we can trust this person, like name any big historical figure, Jesus Christ is more well attested to historically by historical standards. we can trust the Gospels. Now, the other big elephant in this thing is what we call the contradictions. And I haven't put this one on the reading list yet, and I need to remember to add it, but there is a book called Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes. Absolutely incredible. And what it does is it talks about how we hear things like, okay, if I want to know the story that I just told you, I want to know, okay, where was he standing on the court? What time of the game was it? How many fouls were there? And we need it all in chronological order from left to right, top to bottom. That's not how they work in the Eastern culture. So the authors of the book, Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes, were missionaries in Indonesia, which is a very Eastern culture. Not quite what we would call Near East, but a lot closer than we are. And he found little quirks like rules are not black and white there. So if I say, all right, we have a men's room and a women's room, I'm not talking bathrooms, but like, okay, we're gonna have a men's conference or men's class and a women's class. You'd be like, all right, men here, women here, black and white. He was at a conference for the denomination that was over there, and he said, I was told I was speaking to pastors, and much like the SBC, their denominational rules were no female pastors. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm speaking to a bunch of men. He looks out of a room about, I think it was 300, and he's like, there's like 15 women in the room. I was like, so I leaned over to the guy that booked me, and I said, I thought I was only speaking to pastors. He goes, yeah, you are. Everyone in here is a pastor. He said, but we hold that only men can be pastors. He goes, yeah, and most of them are. You see, to them, an exception to a rule was not a problem. When you look at the writings of the Gospels, if you look at the temptation narratives of Jesus, right? Matthew starts in the wilderness, goes to the temple, and then to the mountaintop. But if you read it in Luke, I think it starts in the wilderness, goes to the mountain, and ends on the temple. Now, we as Westerners want to know which one happened, which one's right. Wait, what was it this? Was it like Matthew said it or was it like Luke said it? If you were to put the two of them in a room and ask them that question, their answer would be, they're both right. Because they don't care about chronology as much as they do about impact. And if you read the book of Matthew, Matthew centers his theological moments and the big moments of Matthew on the mountaintop. So naturally, he needs the mountaintop temptation to be last. But if you read the book of Luke, Luke centers on the temple and the priesthood of Christ. So Luke wants the temple temptation to be last and put emphasis on it. And so they would both say, well, they're both accurate. They wouldn't see a problem. So by putting ourselves in their mindset, the contradiction disappears. Why? Because they had a better teaching within the way they wrote. There was more purpose than just A plus B equals C, or, well, in the year 1992, there was a boy born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Paul and Jeannie Williams. Paul was a youth pastor at Grace Baptist Church who worked for his brother Tim. They were the sons of evangelist Dr. Tom Williams, and Jean was a daughter of a farmer from Washington State. And Jeremiah happened to also have at that time an older sister who was 6 years older than him and an older brother who was 5 years older than him. They don't care. They're trying to teach you a point. And for that point to be emphasized, they don't care if things are out of order. And if you read through the Gospels, you'll find there are themes and important messages, what the author's trying to convey to you. And that was more important to them than year 1, year 2, year 3. This teaching led to this teaching, which led to this miracle. They might merge things, okay? And that was okay for them. They didn't think they were lying, because they're from a different culture. The other reference that I want to give, here's a lot of this kind of books specifically with the Gospels. Michael Icona on the bottom is kind of probably the most popular that deals with reliability of the Gospels, but Dr. Lydia McGrew kind of takes a different approach. In this book, she goes through and highlights what are called unexplained coincidences, okay? If you read the Gospels, we see one example of this is the beheading of John the Baptist. We don't. None of those sources, none of those books tell us how that story came to be known. Okay? None of John's disciples were presumably in Herod's court. None of Jesus' disciples were in Herod's court. We don't know. But in a book that, one of the Gospels that doesn't contain the death of John the Baptist, it says this little phrase, and Joanna, who worked in Herod's court, was with the ladies. Completely separate. Completely unattached from any narrative of John the Baptist. And the Gospels are full of these. So in her book here, she goes through a lot of the most common. And what you find is that rather than, let's just say it starts with Mark, and then Matthew takes Mark's work and he adds some stuff to it. And then Luke takes some stuff and adds to that. And then John's down here and he does his own thing. But rather than it looking like this, what we see is actually, when you really dig into these unexplained coincidences, if you take the 4 Gospels, Mark, Luke, and John, you're going to see that there are things written in John that explain problems and holes in Matthew. And you're going to see that things in Matthew explain things in Luke, and things in Luke explain Mark, and Mark explains John, and Mark explains Matthew, and Luke explains John. And it's this whole interweaved net that says this doesn't make sense. This shouldn't be possible if it's fabricated. Kind of an example for this, if we were to investigate a crime, okay? And let's say that Zach is a witness to this crime, and he says, I went to coffee with Jeremy, and it was really, really crowded in there, and we saw this robbery happen, okay? And then the cop interviews me, and I say, yeah, we were at the coffee shop, and Zach spilled his coffee on me, and this robber came in and robbed the store. Okay, well, Zach was more impacted by the fact that there are a bunch of people around. I'm more impacted by the fact that I got coffee on my lap. But the interesting thing is the fact that there's a crowd kind of explains why Zach's coffee got knocked over. That's not something that people who invent stories fabricate. Those are things that we would have to sit down and go, okay, now, remember that coffee you spilled on me? Don't mention it. I'm going to mention it, but I'm not going to mention the crowd. You mention the crowd. That way they really think we're onto something here, right? That they won't suspect. Nobody thinks like that when they're concocting a story. Side note, if you need to concoct a story, do that. It's a lot more believable, okay? But those types of things, those unexplained coincidences, are all throughout all 4 of these books. And with that, we can see a great reliability, because what it says is this person knew things that this person knew. He thought it was more important than what this person did, but it kind of explains something that was left out. You would expect him to maybe say it, but maybe he forgot or whatever reason, but he left out a detail. It begs a question, and he explained it. Now, he came after. Okay, so then what? Let's say that Mark came first and Matthew came after. How come Matthew can also explain things, holes in Mark? And Mark explains holes in Matthew. And it just circles and crisscrosses in this beautiful web that says the only logical explanation is their biographies. And these guys wrote what they saw. And they had different perspectives. But those perspectives are true because they also while they might be minor contradictions, but they do reinforce each other. And it's beautiful. And it's this mosaic that God says, hey, you know what? I've given you this general revelation of who I am. And I gave this special revelation to 3 million people. And then I did it again about 1,500-ish years later. But I'm going to give you something to carry for 2,000 years. So that 2,000 years after this event, you can look back with confidence that I have left you the story of what I came to do for you. And it's miraculous. And it's wonderful. And it's mind-blowing. And it screams of a God who says, I love you and I want to redeem you. Trust me. Any questions or thoughts? Probably. So we got time. On that note, next week we are looking to do the reliability of the resurrection, which hinges very much on this being accurate. The week after that, this was one that was voted in the top part on the wherever that is, and that is the views of hell. There are 3 dominant views of what the afterlife looks like for unbelievers, and there are many people who have different problems with it. One of the beautiful things about apologetics, if you read the book Letters from a Skeptic, he actually uses a view of hell that he doesn't agree with, but he says people do believe this, and you can be a Christian and believe this. You don't have to agree with me. And his dad's like, oh, okay, well that solves that problem. So it's really cool to get to know these other views, even if you don't agree with them. And so I'll kind of give you a hint on that one. Of course, eternal conscious torment, which is the traditional one that most Baptists hold to. Annihilationism, which basically says that God punishes those who are without Christ, but rather than being in eternal torment, their souls are destroyed. And then, of course, the universalism. So we'll talk a little bit about those, some of the problems with each of those. And that will bring us to the week before Thanksgiving. That week there will be no class. Unless everybody just has like a particular topic they want to go between New Year's or Christmas and Thanksgiving, that will probably be our last week. I'm open to go beyond that. Ben has given me the permission to go all the way to Christmas if we want, but I don't want to force it to. If we've hit a good stopping point and everybody's happy, then I'm content to stop then. I'll leave it up to y'all. So if you come in and you're like, hey, I think we should talk about this, then we'll go after Christmas. But if not, let's plan on 2 more weeks, and then I'm going to say we'll call it at Thanksgiving unless you guys have other ideas or things you want to talk about. Does that sound good? All right. Thank y'all for coming. We are out early.
Thank you. So I did hear also that from memories, things that are highly, like emotion, if you have emotion attached to it, then that's more memorable.
Yeah.
What is it?
That's Michael Jones covers that in his video, and it's really good. I ran out of time when I was making my notes because I had ADD so bad last night. I spent probably 30 minutes making 5 slides. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do this at the office. It'll take me a half hour if I can do it when I'm focused. And it turns out I was looking at the wrong video for the facts I was looking for and needed the one before it. So that worked out. But yeah, he's really, really good. Key example of someone that I disagree with. He is actually a theistic evolutionist. If you watch his Genesis stuff, it's really intriguing. I disagree with it, but he does dive really into the Hebrew and the culture and stuff. And it's kind of cool, but I'm like, I still disagree. But a lot of his apologetic work is very, very good. He's done a lot of work like debates against Muslims, just inter-Christian debates against atheism. He's gone into like quantum mechanics and how that works and defends the faith with it. I'm like, yeah, it's all like over my head. But Michael Jones, the channel is Inspiring Philosophy. So he's the one where I got most of this info.
I think Jay Warner Wallace also does like art.
He probably does, but he is my favorite for the resurrection.
For the resurrection?
Yeah.
I'm so sad. I
that's-
gotta go out of town for work next week, so I'm gonna miss that one.
All right, I'll have to get up.
Who was it just named?
Jay
I
Warner
wrote these
Wallace.
down.
Yeah, so Jay Warner Wallace. So if you are on that one, yeah, the access the slides. I actually, if you have a Gmail account, if you don't have a Gmail account, Google's weird and didn't let me send you the link. But if you have a Gmail account and you've signed up for that, you have access to a folder with all my slides, and somebody requested a book list, and I think I put him on there.
Okay.
His book is called Cold Case Christianity. So he is a 2nd or 3rd generation cold case investigator. I know his dad was, and I know his son is.
I think he's
And
second.
he was an atheist. He was an
Is that
atheist.
the guy who was a reporter?
No, so
No,
that's Lee Strobel. So same
That's
thing.
something.
So Lee Strobel was an atheist, so was an investigative reporter, and so he decided to use his investigative techniques to investigate the claims of the gospel.
What was his book? Because he wrote a good book too.
He writes the case series, so Case for
That's
Christ,
what it was.
Case for Faith,
That's what I
the
was
Case for
thinking.
Heaven. He's got a whole series. But Lee Strobel was he closes cold cases. That's what he does, right? I mean, these are
Yeah.
30, 40,
He's
50
on like
years
60
after the
minutes,
fact. Yeah.
like cold case.
And he did it in LA, and I think it was.
Yes.
And so he said one day, as an atheist, he goes, I do this for a living. And he said the gospel would be one of the coldest cases of all. He goes, if it's true, it should match up. If it's false, it shouldn't.
Yep.
And he became a Christian.
Yeah, because he ended up he studied eyewitness testimony. And one thing that he said in his work, which is kind of what you were talking about today, which is you want to separate the witnesses and get their accounts. And he's
Yeah.
like, if everybody gets together and has the same account, it's like trash.
Yep.
And it's also a signal of a made up story
Yes.
when everybody has the exact same story.
Yep.
So I think he uses that argument for
What helped
as
Yeah.
reliability of the gospels.
So really cool. That when I taught in the apologetics class, the first debate they did was are the gospels reliable? And so they relied the pro side relied a lot on this. And then the second debate for their final was, is the resurrection historically trustworthy? And so they used J. Warner Wallace's, and then a couple other, what is probably my favorite, which is kind of an accumulative case of basic facts in psychology, to just say they died suffering, they didn't gain anything. Well, I'm not going to spoil it, we're going to talk about it next week.
But I think J. Warner has an earlier time for Mark, and you mentioned that at
Probably.
the beginning that some
Yeah.
people.
Most
think
scholars
Mark-
today hold to what's called Mark in priority, that Mark was the first. My Bible has the timelines and all this. And it happened right between 60 and 65, which is when Peter at least probably would have been in Rome prior to his crucifixion. Paul, we don't know the exact dates he went to Rome, but it seems to be between 60 to 63. So some of his, what we call the prison letters, some we know were from Rome, right? And some could have been Rome, or they could have been prison prior to Rome, when that time between Felix and Festus and all of that, as he's giving his testimony before he's shipped to Rome. And those are usually attributed to around 62 AD. So thanks for coming. So with that, we get Luke does not contain the death of Paul, or Acts does not contain the death of Paul, or really much of the arrival, right? So pretty much we can assume that about the time Paul and Luke arrived in Rome, Luke was probably hired by Theophilus to begin his account of the gospel. And that would put Luke right around 63 to 65, with Acts being part 2, between 65 and 67. Matthew, we don't really have, other than kind of this source, which said about the time that Peter and Paul were in Rome, which puts us at 60 to 65. And then John is largely believed to have been written. Pretty much all the writings of John were done in Ephesus, probably in Ephesus, because we know Revelation happened in exile on Patmos, but it was likely recorded after it happened. So John is basically boiled alive, and he's the only disciple to not die a martyr's death. So he survives, he's put in exile on the island of Patmos, and then he's released and goes to the city of Ephesus, which is where he did most of his writing, and was then, I believe, just died of old age.
John was boiled alive.
Boiled in oil. And lived.
In the
I didn't remember that either. I didn't remember that.
First
He's all
faith,
one
that's
guy
who-
away.
Oh yeah, and we'll get into that next week. We're actually going to go through all of the 11 disciples, Paul and several other key figures in the Bible, how they died, and you're going to see that all but John died a martyr's death.
And these are from Josephus as the source document?
These are these are largely from early church writings. So this is what's Fox's Book of Martyrs is actually a main source, I think, on a lot of these. And we have other writings from church fathers that confirm a lot of this. Some of these are theories, some of these are tradition. We don't know a lot of them, other than, of course, Stephen, James, the brother of John. Those are really the only two we know from Scripture.